And so that's how I feel. I feel like an announcer at one who gets to talk about the virtues of the people as they come up, and you get to see for yourself that they actually do all of that. So Mark Maurer is a brilliant man. And I say that with no exaggeration. He's a brilliant man. I've been fortunate enough to hear him speak on a number of different occasions, and I'm always blown away by the wealth of information that he provides to people and the straightforward way in which he does it. That's a definite skill. Obviously, he's not a lawyer. We don't learn that.
She said that, not me.
Anyway, Mark is the assistant director of the Sentencing Project, which is based right here in Washington, D.C. And for those of you who've been involved in doing work around drug policy, the Sentencing Project is well known to all of you because it's the place that we all go when we need to get some quick statistics, when we want to have factual information, when we want to talk about what's happening right now in the criminal justice system around the war on drugs. And that's because Mark makes sure that the information is there. And he's the person who plods through all of those monumental government reports so that you can cull out the useful information, because they don't make it that easy for you. And then he condenses it and puts it in a form that the rest of us can get to utilize very easily. His most recent work is this book, Race to Incarcerate. And I'm going to let him talk about what's in the book. But for those of you who haven't read it and don't have it, I suggest that you go out and get it. It's one of those books that should be right next to Marijuana Myths, Marijuana Facts, and Smoke and Mirrors in your lexicon of drug policy books. And don't forget to put some Linda Smith pamphlets, especially the Safety First, right next to it too. Mark.
Thank you. When I get the chance to introduce Deborah next time, then I'll have to return the compliment, but I appreciate it very much. Like Deborah, I'm also a native New Yorker. I used to speak very fast also, but then I lived in the Midwest for a number of years, so that sort of slowed me down a little bit, so I'm sort of midway at the moment. A lot of people have been talking about their kids this afternoon, so why don't I start with that as well. I have two teenage kids, a girl and a boy, and they're both very good kids. I like them. They still like me and my wife. We get along reasonably well most of the time. And as far as I know, neither of my kids uses drugs. I don't know everything they do, but I'm not aware of any signs that they're using drugs. But as a parent, you never know what's going to happen with your kids, of course, and things can change. And I might discover one day that one of my kids was using drugs or having a drug problem or something like that. So what would I do as a parent if I found out one of my kids was having a hard time with their drug problem or so? Well, I have a couple of choices. I could call up the police or call up a prison warden. I know a lot of people in the corrections field. And I could demand that they lock my kid up on a mandatory 5-year prison term and take care of the problem that way. Or I could call my friends who are social workers and find out what kind of treatment program they would recommend for my kid, and I have health insurance and hope that that would pay for the treatment program, and I could deal with the problem that way. I suspect I would choose the latter method for my own kids. That's a more humane way, it's a more effective way to deal with the problem, a more reasonable way all around. But when we look at drug policy nationally and we look at questions of race and criminal justice, I think we're talking about questions of race and talking about questions of class and how they come together. As a middle-class parent with some resources, I would bring a very different approach to the problem because I'd be able to than people in many low-income communities are able to bring to exactly the same problem that I might face someday. So when we look at policy and we look at outcomes, we're talking about race and class together. We're talking about how national policy exaggerates some of those kinds of disparities that we see. Well, when we talk about race and drugs, race and criminal justice have been intertwined since day one in this country. But I think what we're seeing in recent years, particularly with drug policy, is that those connections are even more extreme than they are with criminal justice policies generally. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First, of course, is that we've seen the most significant expansion of the criminal justice system since 1980 has been, of course, through the drug war. In terms of drug arrests, we've gone from 500,000 in 1980 to over 1.5 million today. In terms of numbers of people in prison, we now have 11 times as many people in prison for a drug offense as we did in 1980. We could go on and on, but clearly this is the most significant factor driving the prison population. Now, a second reason why it's important too is that when we talk about drug policy, unlike many other offenses, there's a tremendous amount of discretion that's available to people in the system and to policymakers. If police get a call about a murder, a rape, or an armed robbery, there's not really very many ways they can respond. They are going to go out and aggressively try to find the person who committed that offense, and if the person is brought to trial and convicted, in all likelihood they will go to prison for a substantial period of time. When it comes to drug policy, though, we have a tremendous amount of discretion available to us and a tremendous range of choices that are available in terms of how aggressively we pursue arrests, incarceration, and things like that. And we may disagree among ourselves even here about whether we should enforce these laws at all or have these laws, but if we look nationally at what the picture looks like, even for people who believe that drugs should be illegal and we should have laws stating that, there's still a broad range of practice and what that could look like. Now, what's that affected by? Well, it might be affected by the degree of drug use or drug sales in a neighborhood. It might be affected by a political campaign and candidates trying to outdo each other on how tough they can be on drugs. It might be affected by media images and sensationalizing the drug problem. Might be affected by asset forfeiture laws, which provide incentives to make drug arrests or certain kinds of drug arrests. So we have a whole range of discretionary discretion available that tells us something about what drug policy and practice is going to look like. Now, how does this impact with race? Well, if we look at the trends and the numbers and what's happened in the system, apparently this discretion is used in a way which has really exaggerated a lot of the racial disparities that we see in the system. Back in 1980, African Americans represented about 21% of the people arrested for drug possession offenses. Today, those figures are about 35% or so. Now, we know from government surveys that African Americans constitute about 15% of drug users nationally, yet 35% of the people arrested for possessing drugs. So clearly we have some kind of disconnect there. Something's going on. A black drug user is more likely to get arrested than a white drug user. Well, what happens with people selling drugs? A lot of the politicians will say, well, yeah, but a lot of the serious things we're going after are drug sales, and it may be that drug sales in minority neighborhoods are much higher, and that's why you see such high disproportions of blacks and Latinos getting arrested for drug selling. Well, we don't know enough about drug selling. You can't do random surveys the same way you can about drug use itself in households. We do know there's been a study by the Justice Department that looked in 6 cities at who was selling drugs and who was buying drugs. Their conclusion was that if you bought drugs, it was probably from somebody from the same racial or ethnic group as yourself. Drug czar McCaffrey has said the same thing in his statements as well. And I think if you think about it in very practical terms, if it were not the case, if it were the case that white people were primarily buying drugs from low-income African Americans in poor communities, then we would expect to see in neighborhoods like Anacostia in Washington, in Harlem in New York, and South Central Los Angeles, you would imagine you'd see a steady stream of cars coming in from white suburban areas coming in to buy drugs on a pretty much non-stop basis. Well, there are some people who come in from suburban areas to come and buy drugs in inner city areas, but I think if you walk around those neighborhoods, I don't usually see a huge stream of cars coming in those neighborhoods. Most white people don't want to go in those neighborhoods. That's the way they feel about those kinds of neighborhoods. Instead, they buy drugs from people they know, trust, or at least are familiar with, and that's usually how the transactions take place. So we see that drug use and drug selling very disproportionate in terms of arrests. When people come into the criminal justice system, they're then faced with a whole slew of mandatory sentencing that's been imposed since the early 1980s. The most dramatic ones, of course, are the crack cocaine disparities. In the federal system, 85% of the defendants in crack cases are African American, again, well above the proportion of crack users in the population as a whole. But I think there's a couple of things about the